My name is Maya Johnson, and the day my neighbor Narita tried to take my dog away started like any other Tuesday. The sun had barely risen over our quiet street when Duke nudged my hand with his nose, asking for his morning walk. Duke wasn't just a dog to me. He had been my companion through some of the hardest years of my life. When I lost my father, Duke stayed beside me. When I worked double shifts and came home exhausted, Duke was waiting at the door. To most people in the neighborhood, he was the friendly rescue dog who loved children, chased tennis balls, and somehow knew exactly when someone needed cheering up. That's why what happened next made no sense. After our walk, Duke curled up beside the living room window while I made coffee. Across the street, I noticed Narita Collins standing in her driveway. Narita always seemed to have an opinion about everything happening in the neighborhood. If someone's grass grew too high, she noticed. If a package sat on a porch for too long, she noticed. And lately, she had been paying an unusual amount of attention to Duke. The previous week, I caught her staring at him while he played with a group of neighborhood kids. Another time, she complained that his barking disturbed the peace, even though Duke rarely barked for more than a few seconds. I tried not to think much about it. Life was busy enough without worrying about what Narita thought of me. But that morning, as I watched her from my kitchen window, I had a strange feeling I couldn't explain. She glanced toward my house, pulled out her phone, and started typing. A few minutes later, she got into her car and drove away. I remember shaking my head and laughing to myself. Whatever Narita was upset about this time, it surely couldn't involve me. I was wrong. Less than 2 hours later, someone knocked on my front door. Not the casual knock of a neighbor borrowing sugar. Not the cheerful knock of a delivery driver. This knock was firm, official, and impossible to ignore. Duke immediately stood up and walked beside me. When I opened the door, 2 uniformed officers stood on my porch holding a clipboard. One of them looked down at Duke before looking back at me. "Miss Johnson?" he asked. My stomach tightened. "Yes," I answered. The officer nodded. "We've received a complaint regarding a potentially dangerous dog in the neighborhood." For a moment, I honestly thought there had been some mistake. Duke sat calmly beside me, wagging his tail at the strangers. Then I looked across the street. Through the front window of her beautiful house, I saw Narita standing behind the curtain. She wasn't hiding very well. In fact, it looked like she wanted me to see her watching. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't an accident. Somehow, my neighbor had started something that could change both my life and Duke's forever. What I didn't know was that before the week ended, the entire neighborhood would discover a secret Narita had worked very hard to keep hidden. The officers were polite, but that didn't make the situation any less frightening. One of them explained that animal control had received a formal complaint claiming Duke had shown aggressive behavior toward residents in the neighborhood. I stared at him, genuinely speechless. Aggressive? Duke was many things: clumsy, stubborn, occasionally too excited when someone held a tennis ball, but aggressive was not one of them. The officer asked if he could observe Duke for a few minutes. I stepped aside and invited them in. Duke immediately walked over, tail wagging so hard his entire body moved with it. He sat down in front of the older officer and looked up at him as if hoping for a treat. The younger officer actually laughed. "He doesn't seem very dangerous," he admitted. For a moment I felt relieved. Surely this misunderstanding would be cleared up quickly. But then the older officer explained that because an official complaint had been filed, they were required to complete a review. They would need to interview neighbors, gather statements, and schedule an evaluation. My relief vanished. As soon as the officers left, I looked across the street. Narita's curtain moved. She had been watching the entire time. I wanted to walk over and ask her why she was doing this, but experience told me that confrontation would only make things worse. Instead, I called my mother. Evelyn Johnson had a way of calming me down when life felt unfair. After listening quietly, she sighed and said something that stayed with me. "People usually fight what they don't understand, Maya." At the time, I thought she was talking about Duke. Later, I realized she was talking about Narita. Over the next few days, things became stranger. Neighbors who normally waved during morning walks suddenly seemed uncomfortable. A few avoided eye contact altogether. One woman hurried her child across the street when she saw Duke coming. Another neighbor politely asked if I could walk him somewhere else. Rumors were spreading. The worst part was that nobody came directly to me. They talked to each other. They whispered. They speculated. Every day I could feel the story growing larger than the truth. One evening I overheard two residents discussing Duke near the community mailbox. One claimed he had chased someone. Another insisted he had frightened several children. None of it was true, but by then facts no longer seemed to matter. What mattered was the story people believed. Then something unexpected happened. As Duke and I returned from a walk, Sophia Collins, Narita's daughter, approached us. Sophia had always been kind, even when her mother wasn't. She knelt down and scratched Duke behind the ears. "Good boy," she whispered. Then she glanced toward her house and lowered her voice. I wish people knew what really happened. Before I could ask what she meant, Narita's voice echoed from across the street. "Sophia." Her daughter immediately stood up. The nervous look on her face caught my attention. As she hurried away, she turned back for a brief second. There was something she wanted to say. I could see it, but she never got the chance. That night I couldn't stop thinking about those words. What really happened? The next morning, I received an official letter confirming Duke's evaluation date. My hands trembled as I read it. If things went badly, I could lose him. I sat on my porch watching Duke sleep in the yard, completely unaware that his future was being debated by strangers. Across the street, Narita was arranging flowers near her mailbox as if nothing unusual was happening. For the first time, I began to wonder if this was about more than a complaint. Something didn't add up. Sophia knew something. Narita was hiding something. And somewhere in the middle of all the rumors and accusations was a truth that nobody seemed willing to talk about. I just didn't know yet that discovering that truth would change the entire neighborhood. The days leading up to Duke's evaluation felt longer than any week I could remember. Everywhere I went, I could feel the neighborhood watching me differently. It wasn't open hostility. In some ways that would have been easier. Instead it was uncertainty. Doubt. The kind that spreads quietly from one conversation to another until people begin questioning things they never questioned before. One afternoon, while checking my mailbox, I noticed two neighbors standing near the community bulletin board. The moment they saw me, their conversation stopped. Both smiled awkwardly before walking away. I tried to ignore it, but the silence spoke louder than words. By then, Duke had become the subject of endless speculation. Some people claimed he had frightened children. Others insisted he had chased cyclists. The stories kept growing, even though nobody could provide a clear example of what had actually happened. What bothered me most was how quickly rumors could replace reality. Duke was still the same dog who greeted delivery drivers with a wagging tail. The same dog who sat patiently while neighborhood children read books beside him during summer afternoons. Yet suddenly people were seeing him through a completely different lens. A few days before the evaluation, I received a phone call from Animal Control. The officer explained that several statements had been submitted regarding Duke's behavior. I asked if any of them described a specific incident. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Not exactly," he admitted. "Most of the complaints seemed to reference concerns rather than actual events." That answer stayed with me. Concerns rather than events. In other words, people were describing what they feared might happen, not what had happened. After hanging up, I sat on my porch thinking about it while Duke rested beside my chair. Across the street, Narita was speaking with another resident. The moment she noticed me looking, she turned away. It was subtle, but something about her behavior felt different. She wasn't acting like someone who was protecting the neighborhood. She was acting like someone protecting a story. That evening, an unexpected visitor knocked on my door. It was Mr. Harrison. The elderly neighbor stepped inside and accepted a cup of coffee before lowering himself into a chair. He spent several minutes talking about ordinary things before finally getting to the point. "I've lived on this street for 30 years, he said. "I've seen arguments about fences, trees, parking spaces, and just about everything else. But this situation feels strange." I asked him what he meant. He leaned forward slightly. "Because nobody can tell me exactly what Duke did." The words echoed my own thoughts. Mr. Harrison explained that he had quietly asked several residents about the complaints. Every story was different. One person claimed Duke barked too much. Another claimed he ran too fast. Someone else insisted they had heard he scared a child. But nobody had actually witnessed a serious problem. The more we talked, the more confused I became. If there wasn't a real incident, Then why had Narita pushed so hard for an investigation? Before leaving, Mr. Harrison said something that caught my attention. "You should talk to Sophia." My heart skipped a beat. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated. "Because every time this topic comes up, that girl looks like she's carrying a secret." The next afternoon I got my chance. Sophia was walking home from school when she noticed Duke and me sitting in the front yard. She approached slowly and glanced toward her house to make sure her mother wasn't outside. Duke immediately wagged his tail and trotted over to greet her. Sophia smiled and rubbed his head. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then I finally asked the question that had been bothering me all week. "Sophia, what did you mean when you said you wished people knew what really happened?" Her smile disappeared. The color drained from her face. She looked terrified. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she whispered, "I can't tell you." Before I could respond, she added something even more surprising. "But Duke didn't do what everyone thinks he did." My pulse quickened. "Then what happened?" Sophia opened her mouth as if she were about to answer. Suddenly a voice called her name from across the street. Narita was standing on her porch, watching us. Sophia immediately stepped back. Fear flashed across her eyes. Without another word, she turned and hurried home. As I watched her leave, I knew one thing for certain. The truth existed. Sophia knew it. Narita knew it. And whatever really happened was important enough that one person was afraid to speak, and another seemed determined to keep it buried. After my conversation with Sophia, I couldn't stop thinking about the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the kind of fear a teenager shows when she's worried about getting grounded or disappointing a parent. It was deeper than that. It was the look of someone trapped between telling the truth and protecting someone they loved. For the next 2 days I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept returning to the same question. What was Narita hiding? The answer seemed closer than ever, yet still completely out of reach. Meanwhile, the situation with Duke continued to get worse. The upcoming evaluation had become the biggest topic in the neighborhood. People discussed it while walking their dogs, collecting mail, and attending community events. Every conversation seemed to include a new version of the story. Some residents now believed Duke had threatened multiple people. Others claimed animal control was preparing serious action. None of it was true, but once rumors gained momentum, facts struggled to catch up. The hardest part wasn't the gossip. It was watching Duke remain exactly the same while people's opinions about him changed. One afternoon, a group of neighborhood children approached my yard carrying a tennis ball. They had played with Duke for years. This time, however, their parents called them back before they reached the gate. The disappointment on the children's faces broke my heart. Duke sat by the fence watching them leave, confused by a situation he couldn't possibly understand. That evening I received another surprise. A notice had been posted on the neighborhood bulletin board, announcing a special community meeting regarding safety concerns. Safety concerns. Everyone knew exactly what that meant. Narita had succeeded in turning Duke into a neighborhood issue. The meeting was scheduled for the night before his official evaluation. The timing couldn't have been accidental. As expected, attendance was unusually high. Nearly every chair in the community center was occupied. I sat near the back with Duke resting quietly beside me. Narita sat near the front. She looked calm, confident, and completely prepared. When the meeting began, several residents shared general concerns about neighborhood safety. Then Narita stood up. The room immediately became quiet. She spoke carefully, choosing every word with precision. She never exaggerated. She never sounded emotional. In fact, that made her argument more effective. She described Duke as unpredictable. She described feeling uncomfortable walking near my house. She described concerns for children and elderly residents. Yet something about her story still felt incomplete. Every statement focused on what might happen, not what actually happened. Then came the moment that changed everything. Narita told the room that a young girl had once been frightened so badly by Duke that she ran home in tears. Several people gasped softly. The story sounded serious, convincing, and completely new. I had never heard it before. Neither had Mr. Harrison, judging by the expression on his face. I immediately looked toward Sophia. She was sitting beside her mother. The moment Narita finished speaking, Sophia lowered her head. She looked miserable. That's when I noticed something else. Her hands were trembling. The room began discussing the incident. Some residents nodded sympathetically. Others looked uncomfortable. I wanted to stand up and defend myself, but I knew emotions wouldn't help. Facts would. The problem was that I still didn't have them. When the meeting ended, people slowly filed toward the exit. Narita remained surrounded by several supportive neighbors. She looked more confident than ever. As I prepared to leave, Sophia suddenly appeared beside me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That girl my mom talked about," she said. My heart immediately started racing. Sophia looked over her shoulder to make sure Narita wasn't nearby. Then she leaned closer. "There was a girl," she admitted. "But that's not what happened." Before I could ask another question, Narita called her name from across the room. Panic flashed across Sophia's face. She quickly stepped away and joined her mother. But this time she had already revealed something important. Narita's story contained a real event. The girl existed. The incident existed. Yet the version being told to the neighborhood wasn't the truth. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt certain that the answers were within reach. I just needed to find someone brave enough to tell the whole story before it was too late. The morning of Duke's evaluation arrived with a heavy silence hanging over the neighborhood. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined worst-case scenarios. Duke seemed unaware of any danger. He stretched lazily across the living room floor, occasionally lifting his head whenever I walked past. Looking at him only made the situation feel more unfair. How could a dog who spent most of his time chasing tennis balls and begging for treats suddenly become the center of so much suspicion? By mid-morning, the animal control officer arrived. Unlike the previous officers, this evaluator wasn't there to gather opinions. He was there to observe facts. That gave me a small sense of hope. The evaluation began in my backyard. Duke followed basic commands without hesitation. He sat, stayed, came when called, and calmly interacted with strangers. The officer carefully observed everything, making notes on his clipboard. After nearly an hour, he seemed satisfied. But before leaving, he explained that the final decision would include both his evaluation and the neighborhood complaints. Hearing those words felt like someone had punched the air out of my lungs. Even if Duke performed perfectly, the rumors could still influence the outcome. Once the officer left, I sat on the porch feeling more helpless than I had since this ordeal began. For the first time, I wondered if Narita might actually win. Maybe the truth wouldn't matter. Maybe perception had already become stronger than reality. As I sat there, my phone rang. It was Mr. Harrison. His voice sounded unusually serious. He asked me to meet him at the community garden immediately. 20 minutes later, I found him waiting near one of the flower beds. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him was an elderly woman named Mrs. Delgado. She had lived in the neighborhood for years but rarely attended community events. After a brief introduction, she got straight to the point. "I think I know the girl Narita was talking about," she said. My heart immediately started racing. Mrs. Delgado explained that several months earlier, a young child had indeed become frightened while walking near my property. But according to her, Duke wasn't the cause. The real cause had been a loud construction truck that unexpectedly backfired nearby. The noise startled the child, who began crying. Duke had actually approached and sat beside the girl until her mother arrived. I stared at her in disbelief. The story was the exact opposite of what Narita had implied during the meeting. "Are you sure?" I asked. Mrs. Delgado nodded firmly. I watched the whole thing from my porch. For the first time in days, I felt genuine hope. Finally, there was someone willing to challenge the narrative. But before I could celebrate, Mr. Harrison delivered another surprise. He had spent the past week quietly speaking with residents. According to him, almost every complaint traced back to the same source: Narita. Some people had never even interacted with Duke directly. They simply trusted Narita's version of events because she presented herself as a reliable community voice. The realization was both frustrating and revealing. This wasn't really about Duke anymore. It was about influence. Narita had shaped the story before anyone bothered to verify the facts. As we talked, I noticed someone standing near the edge of the garden. It was Sophia. She looked nervous but determined. After making sure nobody else was nearby, she slowly approached us. Mr. Harrison gave her an encouraging smile. For several seconds, Sophia remained silent. Then she finally spoke. My mom wasn't there that day. I froze. What do you mean? Sophia swallowed hard. The day with the little girl. Mom didn't see what happened. She only heard about it afterward. The pieces suddenly began fitting together. Narita had built her strongest argument around an event she hadn't even witnessed. Yet Sophia wasn't finished. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the ground. There's something else, she whispered. Something nobody knows. My pulse quickened. Every instinct told me I was finally standing at the edge of the truth. But before Sophia could continue, a familiar voice echoed across the garden. Narita. She was walking toward us from the parking area. The moment Sophia saw her mother approaching, fear returned to her face. She immediately stepped back. Whatever secret she had been about to reveal, it was important enough that she still couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. Narita smiled politely as she reached us, but something about her expression seemed different now. Less confident. Less certain. For the first time since this nightmare began, it looked as though she was beginning to worry that the story she had worked so hard to control was starting to unravel. After Narita arrived at the community garden, the conversation ended almost instantly. Sophia became quiet again, and whatever secret she had nearly revealed disappeared behind a nervous smile. Narita greeted everyone politely, but I couldn't stop noticing the way her eyes moved from Sophia to me, and then back again. It was the look of someone checking whether a conversation had gone further than expected. For the rest of that day, I replayed the scene in my mind. Sophia had been seconds away from telling the truth. Something had stopped her. More importantly, something was making her afraid. The following evening, the neighborhood held its monthly outdoor gathering in the small park, near the entrance of our subdivision. Normally these events were relaxed. Families brought food, children played games, and neighbors caught up on local news. But this time the atmosphere felt different. People were still talking about Duke. Even when they weren't mentioning him directly, I could feel the subject lingering beneath every conversation. Some residents treated me with sympathy. Others remained distant. A few seemed unsure what to believe anymore. The rumors that had once spread so easily were now colliding with new questions. And questions have a way of making certainty disappear. As the sun began setting, I sat at one of the picnic tables with Duke resting beside me. Several children approached to pet him, and their parents didn't stop them. That alone felt like progress. Then something unexpected happened. Sophia quietly sat down across from me. Narita was busy talking with a group of neighbors on the other side of the park. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Duke lifted his head, recognized Sophia, and immediately walked over to greet her. She smiled and scratched behind his ears. He really is a good dog, she whispered. I nodded. I know. Sophia stared at the ground for several seconds. Then she took a deep breath. The day with the little girl. She began. My heart immediately started beating faster. What about it? Sophia looked around carefully before continuing. The girl wasn't scared of Duke. I already knew that part from Mrs. Delgado, but I stayed silent. Sophia needed to tell the story in her own words. She got scared because of the construction truck, Sophia said. Duke actually went over to her after she started crying. Her voice trembled slightly. He sat next to her until her mom came. Hearing it confirmed by Narita's own daughter made the story feel even more powerful. But I could tell there was still more. Sophia kept glancing toward her mother. Finally, she lowered her voice even further. My mom knows that. For a second, I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. What do you mean she knows? Sophia swallowed hard. Because I was there. The noise of the park seemed to disappear around me. You were there. She nodded. I told her exactly what happened that day. I stared at her in disbelief. Every complaint, every meeting, every rumor. Narita had known the truth from the beginning. Before I could respond, Sophia's eyes filled with tears. I tried to tell her to stop, she admitted. I told her Duke didn't do anything wrong. The sadness in her voice broke my heart. This wasn't just hurting me. It was hurting her too. For months she had been carrying a truth that nobody wanted to hear. Suddenly, a new voice interrupted us. Sophia. We both looked up. Mr. Harrison was standing nearby. He had apparently overheard enough to understand what was happening. Instead of looking surprised, he looked disappointed. Not in Sophia. In the situation itself. He gently sat down beside us and spoke in a calm voice. The truth has a way of finding daylight eventually. Sophia wiped her eyes. I don't want to hurt my mom. Mr. Harrison nodded. And telling the truth doesn't mean you don't love her. Those words seemed to affect Sophia deeply. She looked toward Narita, who was still laughing and chatting with neighbors as if nothing were wrong. Then Sophia looked back at Duke. What happens if nobody says anything? She asked. No one answered immediately. We all knew the answer. Duke's reputation would remain damaged. People would continue believing a story that wasn't true. And Narita would never be forced to face what she had done. As darkness settled over the park, the gathering slowly began to end. Families packed up their chairs and food containers. Children headed home. But before leaving, Sophia turned to me one last time. There was a new determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The neighborhood meeting is tomorrow night, she said quietly. Then she paused. And I think everyone deserves to know what really happened. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Because I finally realized the truth wasn't hiding anymore. It was preparing to speak. The day of the neighborhood meeting arrived with a tension that seemed to settle over the entire street. Even before I left for work that morning, I noticed small groups of neighbors talking on sidewalks and front porches. Everyone knew the meeting would address the complaints surrounding Duke. What nobody knew was that something much bigger was about to happen. Throughout the day, my phone buzzed with messages from residents asking how I was doing. A week earlier, many of those same people had kept their distance. Now the mood was beginning to shift. Questions were replacing assumptions. Doubt was replacing certainty. And once people start questioning a story, it becomes much harder to control. Still, I couldn't relax. Sophia's words echoed in my mind. She wanted the truth to come out, but wanting something and actually doing it were very different things. She was still a teenage girl being asked to stand against her own mother in front of the entire neighborhood. That kind of pressure would be difficult for anyone. By evening, the community center was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Every chair was filled. Several residents stood along the walls. The atmosphere felt less like a routine neighborhood meeting, and more like a public hearing. Duke remained at home with my mother. I didn't want him sitting through another room full of people debating his character. As I entered, I immediately spotted Narita near the front. She looked confident but not as confident as before. There was a stiffness in her posture that hadn't been there during previous meetings. For the first time, she seemed uncertain about how the evening might unfold. Sophia sat beside her, unusually quiet. Mr. Harrison occupied a seat near the center of the room. Mrs. Delgado sat nearby. Both looked calm, almost as if they already knew how the night would end. When the meeting began, the HOA president reviewed the situation. He explained that the purpose of the gathering was to discuss community concerns before the final report from animal control was completed. Then he invited residents to speak. Narita was the first person to stand. Once again, she presented herself as a concerned neighbor trying to protect the community. She spoke about responsibility, safety, standards. Her words were carefully chosen, and if someone hadn't followed the situation closely, they might have found her convincing. Several people nodded politely. Others remained silent. Then came the moment that changed everything. The HOA president asked whether anyone else wished to speak. For a few seconds nobody moved. The room became completely still. Then Sophia slowly stood up. A wave of surprise moved through the audience. Even Narita looked startled. Sophia? She asked quietly. Her daughter didn't sit back down. Instead, Sophia walked toward the front of the room. I could see her hands shaking. I could see the fear in her eyes. But I could also see something stronger. Determination. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. I need to tell the truth. The room fell silent. Narita's face immediately lost color. Sophia took a deep breath and continued. She explained how she had been present during the incident involving the young girl months earlier. She described the loud construction truck. She described the frightened child. She described Duke walking over and sitting beside the girl until help arrived. Then she said the words nobody expected. Duke didn't scare her. He comforted her. A murmur spread through the room. Several people exchanged shocked looks. Narita stared straight ahead. Sophia wasn't finished. With tears forming in her eyes, she admitted that she had already told her mother the full story months ago. She explained that Narita had known the truth from the beginning. The silence that followed felt enormous. For the first time since this entire ordeal started, nobody was looking at me. Every eye in the room was on Narita. The confident woman who had spent weeks shaping the narrative suddenly looked very small. The HOA president slowly turned toward her. "Mrs. Collins," he said carefully, "is this true?" Narita opened her mouth but couldn't answer immediately. Around the room, neighbors began whispering. Some looked disappointed. Others looked hurt. Many simply looked confused. They had trusted her. They had repeated her concerns. They had believed her version of events. And now they were discovering that the foundation of the entire controversy might never have been accurate. Sitting in my chair, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, sadness, vindication. None of it felt like victory. Because while the truth was finally emerging, I could also see the pain on Sophia's face. This wasn't easy for her. She wasn't trying to embarrass her mother. She was trying to do what was right. And in that moment I realized that Sophia might be the bravest person in the room. What happened next would determine not only Duke's future, but also whether our neighborhood was willing to confront a truth many people had helped spread without ever stopping to verify it. For several long seconds after the HOA president asked his question, Narita remained completely silent. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. Just days earlier, she had spoken with confidence, presenting herself as the voice of reason and responsibility. Now that confidence was gone. The story she had carefully built over weeks was beginning to collapse under the weight of a simple truth. Sophia stood quietly near the front of the room, tears still in her eyes. I could only imagine how difficult this moment was for her. She wasn't just correcting a misunderstanding. She was challenging her own mother in front of friends, neighbors, and people she had known her entire life. Finally, Narita spoke. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. She admitted that Sophia had told her what happened on the day of the incident. She admitted that Duke had not frightened the young girl. The room immediately filled with whispers. Some residents looked shocked. Others looked disappointed. But then Narita said something that surprised everyone, including me. She explained that after hearing about the incident, she had convinced herself that Duke was still a problem. She said she had become so focused on her concerns that she stopped separating facts from assumptions. The explanation wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it revealed something important. This situation hadn't grown because of one event. It had grown because someone allowed their assumptions to become stronger than the truth. One by one, neighbors began speaking. Mrs. Delgado stood and calmly shared what she had witnessed that day. Another resident talked about how Duke had always been gentle with children. A retired teacher described seeing Duke sit patiently beside elderly neighbors during afternoon walks. Story after story painted a picture completely different from the one that had dominated the neighborhood for weeks. The more people spoke, the more obvious it became that most residents had never actually experienced a problem with Duke themselves. They had simply trusted the concerns being repeated around them. Then something unexpected happened. The animal control evaluator, who had attended the meeting to answer questions, stood up from the back row. He reviewed his observations from the official evaluation. Duke had shown no signs of aggression. He had responded well to commands. He had behaved calmly around strangers. Based on both his evaluation and the new information presented at the meeting, he saw no reason for further action. The room erupted into applause. I hadn't realized how much tension I had been carrying until that moment. For the first time in weeks I could finally breathe. Duke would be fine. The nightmare was over. Yet the biggest surprise of the evening was still to come. Mr. Harrison slowly rose from his seat. The room immediately quieted. Everyone respected him. Everyone listened when he spoke. He looked around at the crowd before saying something I will never forget. This was never really about a dog. The room became silent. Mr. Harrison explained how quickly rumors can spread when people stop asking questions. He talked about the danger of making assumptions about neighbors instead of getting to know them. Then he turned toward me. Maya has lived on this street for years, he said. She's helped organize food drives, checked on elderly residents during storms, and volunteered whenever someone needed help. Yet somehow, many of us found it easier to believe a rumor than trust someone we already knew. Several heads lowered around the room, including my own, because the truth was uncomfortable. The problem wasn't just Narita. The problem was that too many people had accepted a story without looking for facts. Narita sat quietly throughout his speech. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely reflective. When the meeting finally ended, neighbors approached me one after another. Some apologized. Others simply thanked me for staying calm through the situation. The atmosphere felt completely different from the fear and suspicion that had dominated the previous weeks. As people slowly left the building, I noticed Narita standing alone near the exit. For a brief moment our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. There would be time for conversations later. What mattered now was that the truth had finally reached the people who needed to hear it. As I walked outside beneath the evening sky, I realized that the meeting had done more than clear Duke's name. It had forced our neighborhood to look at itself. And sometimes that's the hardest truth of all. The morning after the meeting felt different. For the first time in weeks, I stepped outside without feeling the weight of suspicious glances following me down the street. The air seemed lighter. The neighborhood seemed quieter. Even Duke appeared to sense that something had changed. He trotted beside me during our morning walk with the same carefree energy he had always had, stopping occasionally to greet familiar faces. But this time people greeted him back. Children waved. Neighbors smiled. One elderly resident even handed him a dog biscuit from her pocket. It was such a simple moment, yet it nearly brought tears to my eyes. Not because Duke was getting treats, but because the cloud hanging over him had finally disappeared. As the days passed, more residents reached out. Some apologized for believing rumors. Others admitted they should have asked questions sooner. What surprised me most was how honest many of them were. They weren't making excuses. They were acknowledging that they had allowed assumptions to influence their judgment. Those conversations reminded me that communities aren't built because people never make mistakes. They're built because people are willing to learn from them. A week later, another unexpected moment occurred. I was watering flowers in my front yard when I noticed someone walking across the street toward my house. First, I didn't recognize her. Then I realized it was Narita. For a second, I wondered if she might turn around. She looked nervous, uncomfortable. Nothing like the confident woman who usually seemed in control of every situation. When she reached my driveway, she stopped. Neither of us spoke immediately. Duke walked over and sat beside me. Narita looked down at him and gave a small smile. "He's a good dog," she said quietly. Hearing those words from her felt almost surreal. I nodded. "Yes, he is." She looked away for a moment before taking a deep breath. Then she apologized. Not just for filing the complaint. Not just for repeating assumptions. She apologized for allowing her opinion of me to shape the way she saw everything connected to me. There was a sincerity in her voice that I hadn't heard before. For the first time, she wasn't trying to defend herself. She wasn't trying to win an argument. She was simply accepting responsibility. I could tell how difficult that was for her. Part of me wanted to remind her how much stress she had caused. How many sleepless nights I had spent worrying. How close I came to losing Duke. But standing there, looking at someone who genuinely regretted her actions, I realized that holding on to anger would only keep the story alive. So instead, I said something that surprised even me. "I appreciate you coming over." Narita looked relieved. Not forgiven completely. Trust doesn't return that quickly. But relieved. Before leaving, she glanced toward the street where Sophia was waiting. "She was braver than I was," Narita admitted. I looked at Sophia and smiled. Yes, she was. After Narita walked away, Duke nudged my hand with his nose, demanding attention as usual. I laughed and scratched behind his ears. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal after that. Children played outside. Neighbors chatted across fences. Life moved forward. Yet something important had changed beneath the surface. People seemed more willing to talk to one another directly, more willing to ask questions instead of accepting rumors, more willing to see the person before the story. A month later, during another community gathering, Mr. Harrison stood and raised a toast. He wasn't celebrating Duke. He wasn't celebrating me. He was celebrating something bigger. To good neighbors, he said. Not perfect neighbors, just good ones who keep learning. Everyone laughed and raised their cups. Looking around at the crowd, I realized how close we had come to allowing a false story to divide us. Instead, the truth had brought us together. As the evening sun dipped below the rooftops, Duke lay peacefully beside my chair while neighbors talked and children played nearby. It wasn't a dramatic ending. There were no headlines, no grand speeches, just a community choosing understanding over assumptions. And maybe that's what real victories look like. Before heading home, I looked down at Duke and smiled. Then I thought about everything that had happened and the lesson it left behind. People often believe they can understand someone from a distance. A quick glance, a rumor, a first impression. But the truth is, every person has a story. Every family has a story. Every neighbor has a story. And if this experience taught me anything, it's that the moment we stop listening to those stories is the moment we start getting each other wrong. My name is Maya Johnson, and that's how my neighbor Narita tried to take away my dog, only to help our entire neighborhood learn a lesson none of us will ever forget. About 3 months after everything happened, I thought the story had finally come to an end. Life on our street felt normal again. Duke had returned to being the unofficial mascot of the neighborhood. Children stopped by after school to play fetch with him. Residents waved when we passed during our morning walks. Even the mail carrier kept dog treats in his pocket. The tension that once seemed impossible to escape had slowly faded into memory. Then one Saturday morning, I received an invitation that completely surprised me. The neighborhood association was organizing a community appreciation event, and they wanted me to help lead it. First I laughed. A few months earlier, some of the same people attending that event had questioned whether my dog belonged in the neighborhood. Now they were asking for my help bringing the community together. Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. The event took place in the same park where so many difficult conversations had happened. Families brought food, local musicians volunteered to perform, and children ran from booth to booth collecting prizes. As I looked around, I realized how much had changed. People who barely knew each other before were talking. New residents were being welcomed. Even small disagreements seemed easier to resolve, because neighbors had learned the importance of listening before judging. Near the end of the afternoon, the HOA president stepped onto a small stage to thank the volunteers. He spoke about community, trust, and the lessons learned over the past year. Then he surprised me by asking me to say a few words. Public speaking had never been my favorite thing, but I agreed. Standing in front of the crowd, I saw familiar faces everywhere. Mr. Harrison smiling proudly. Mrs. Delgado waving from the front row. Sophia sitting beside a group of friends. Even Narita was there. For a moment I wasn't sure what to say. Then I looked down and saw Duke lying peacefully beside the stage. Suddenly the words came naturally. I told everyone that communities aren't defined by perfect people. They're defined by people willing to grow. I talked about mistakes, assumptions, forgiveness, and second chances. Most importantly, I reminded them that every person carries a story others cannot see. Sometimes those stories explain struggles. Sometimes they explain fears. Sometimes they explain strengths. But we never discover them if we decide who someone is before taking the time to know them. The crowd applauded politely when I finished, but the moment that stayed with me happened afterward. As people began packing up their chairs, Narita approached me once again. This time there was no tension between us. No argument waiting to happen. She simply stood beside me and watched the children playing in the grass. After a long silence, she smiled and said, "I spend a lot of time thinking I understood people." I looked at her. She shook her head and laughed softly. Turns out I didn't know nearly as much as I thought I did. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't a grand gesture. But it was honest. And sometimes honesty is enough. As the sun began setting over the neighborhood, families slowly headed home. Duke chased one final tennis ball across the park before collapsing dramatically in the grass, exhausted from all the attention. Everyone laughed. Looking around at my neighbors, I realized that the greatest outcome wasn't that Duke had been cleared. It wasn't that rumors had been corrected. It wasn't even that Narita had changed. The greatest outcome was that people had learned to pause before assuming the worst about one another. In a world where judgments often happen faster than conversations, that lesson felt more valuable than ever. My name is Maya Johnson, and if there's one thing this neighborhood taught me, it's that understanding begins the moment we choose curiosity over assumptions. And sometimes, all it takes to change a community is one truth brave enough to be spoken out loud.